Good afternoon, everybody. I hope everybody's having a great time, and it's been really, I've had some great conversations here, and I'm making some great connections, and I'm learning a lot from you, and I hope that you all are having kind of the same experience that I am. It's an absolute pleasure to welcome Andrew Golis to Yale. I've known Andrew for a while, and Andrew is the first person to. There's an LCD Sound System song called "Losing My Edge," and it's about the people who are right behind you, who are smarter and better looking and are really nice, and kind of the uncomfortableness that causes you and the anxiety it causes. And Andrew is definitely the first person who really made me feel that way. And when I read your bio, when I read Andrew's bio, you'll kind of see why. Andrew Golis is an award-winning publisher, editor, and entrepreneur. He's the general manager of Vox. Vox Media's ambitious and influential general news brand. Launched in 2014, Vox is widely recognized as a pioneer in explanatory journalism and an industry leader in finding new ways to bring vital insights and context to a digital audience across mediums and platforms. Vox Media is a portfolio of 8 brands that collectively reach 170 million people each month. The company is widely recognized as one of the most successful digital media startups in the world. As general manager, Golis works at the intersection of editorial, product, marketing, and sales to drive Vox's overall business strategy and growth initiatives. Golis speaks regularly on the challenges of building meaningful and sustainable organizations in the midst of constant technological change. He's been a featured speaker at the Columbia Journalism School, UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism, the Paley Center for Media, the New York Idea Festival, Tribeca Interactive, the New York Times BBC Social Media Summit, and now Yale. In 2015, was a judge for the Tribeca Film Festival's prestigious Interactive Award. Back when he was under 30, Forbes put Golis on its list of 30 people under 30 watching media. Golis also serves on the advisory boards of Guardian Mobile Innovation Lab as a former board member of the Media Consortium. Prior to joining Vox, Golis was the CEO and founder of the link share service This. This was amazing. It was definitely one of the most innovative social platforms that I've ever seen, and there's a lot to learn from the slow news, and hopefully we'll talk a little bit about that. The platform helped audiences find the best of the web by limiting curators and publishers to sharing just one link each day. BuzzFeed put this on its list of favorite tech things in 2015. Panda called it the Facebook alternative that actually made sense. The New York Times wrote about it, how people were clamoring to join. This was incubated at The Atlantic, where Golis was the historic magazine's first entrepreneur in residence. In that role, in addition to building the prototype for this, Golis advised the company's owner and executive on mobile, video, and social media strategy. Prior to The Atlantic, Golis served as the director of digital media and senior editor at Frontline, PBS's flagship investigative documentary series. During his tenure overseeing digital editorial strategy and product for the series, Frontline won 3 online journalism awards, a half-dozen Webby Awards, 2 Emmy nominations for digital storytelling, and an Overseas Press Club Award for digital innovation. Prior to Frontline, Golis built a network of blogs at Yahoo News that the New York Observer called one of the biggest media launches of 2010 and helped build the award-winning independent political site Talking Points Memo, which Time Magazine's called the prototype of what a successful web-based news organization is likely to be in the future. Golis graduated with honors from Harvard College, where he studied American political history. He lives in Brooklyn, New York, with his wife, the wonderful Jessica Valenti, and daughter and dog. Please join me in a huge Yale welcome to Andrew.
That was an introduction that is destined to make me disappointing. I can't believe you read the entirety of that official bio, full of all the propaganda.
It gives me all the anxiety. All the anxiety.
Good morning, everyone, and it's really nice to be here. It's a real honor, despite the Yale-Harvard thing. In a previous edition of when I was maybe going to do an actual slide deck, I had a slide that said, "Insert Harvard-Yale joke here, parentheses, try to act like you care." I don't think I ever went to any of the games. I probably drank outside of one or two of them. But like Franz said, we met about a decade ago, back when there were powerful people across our kind of economy and culture who thought that the internet was a fad. And we were a part of a kind of ragtag group of technologists and writers who would hang out in kind of dive bars in New York and Washington, D.C. and talk about all of the exciting things, all of the ways in which the internet was going to transform our media and our economy and our politics. And it turns out the internet was not a fad. And those conversations in dive bars did take us a long way to this location. And as Franz just overly generously narrated through, in the last 10 years, I've helped run an investigative TV show, Storied Magazine, my own social media startup, and now what I think is probably the fastest growing news startup in the country. Considering that 10 years, it's actually striking to me how right we were, obviously, about the kind of scale of change. I think what we've seen in the last 10 years has been pretty breathtaking. But it's also, I think, worth focusing on the fact that we were probably couldn't have predicted a lot of the details or the character of that change. I think if we look around today at the media and political landscape, the economy, there are a lot of things that have changed for the better and a lot of things that have changed, I think, pretty significantly for the worse. So today I want to talk a little bit about the internet that's been built in those 10 years, and in particular about the kind of dynamics of social media. And I want to offer a way of thinking about the challenges we face when we try to build something that relies on communicating through screens and platforms, something that I know is a kind of centerpiece of everything that you all do and think about. Most of this talk will focus on a fairly straightforward metaphor for that challenge, and I hope in the conversation with Franz and with all of you later, we can talk about some of the more kind of concrete things underneath that and get into some of the actual examples and some of the work that I've done and that you all are doing. But I want to focus on setting up the kind of image that I have that is demonstrated up here. Don't worry, this slide won't change. It'll just be staring at you the whole time. To give us a kind of framework to start to ground ourselves really kind of in a very simple way and understanding what the world we live in now, so that 10 years from now when we look back we can say, okay, we understood the challenge we faced and we tried to address it in meaningful ways. So let's start by imagining two strangers sitting across from each other who have been asked to build a trusting relationship from scratch. Right? So we have our chairs here. They know nothing about each other than what they can learn by listening to and watching each other. In between them is a pane of glass. The two start chatting through the glass, normal getting to know you kind of stuff. They can see and hear each other just fine despite the glass. And they learn each other's names, chat a bit about what brought them to this weird experiment that I've imagined in my speech, and talk about their lives. But as the conversation changes gears, one of them notices something. She becomes aware that the glass is changing in two ways. First, it gets more opaque, making it harder to see the man sitting across from her. And second, it gets thicker, making it harder for her to hear him. The two changes always come at the same time. The glass shifts from opaque and thick to thin and transparent as the conversation moves from topic to topic. Despite the changes in the glass, the conversation continues. After a few more minutes, the woman who's noticed the changes begins to see a pattern. When the conversation is light and funny, or intense and angry, the glass gets thin and clear, so much so that it's almost not there. The two can hear and see each other easily, and the conversation is fun and engaging. The two laugh together, build on each other's silliness. They talk about politics, share a sense of outrage about a crazy headline in the news that week. But when the woman tries to convey uncertainty about that political story, the glass becomes so thick and dark that it's nearly a wall. Later, when she fumbles through an intimate story about her relationship with her children, the same thing. These changes, she realizes, aren't random. The glass between them has some kind of hidden but consistent rules. The glass changes based on what tone and what topic is being discussed. Some tones and topics generate a clear, thin glass. Others generate a thick, opaque barrier between them. And so, in an effort to connect with this stranger, she tells more jokes. Thinks up more politicians who are likely to bother both of them. Meanwhile, her partner hasn't noticed the glass at all. When the glass becomes thick and opaque, he wonders if his eyes and ears are just failing him, or if she's suddenly muttering or changing the lighting on her side of the room. But he can intuitively sense that some parts of the conversation are more engaging than others. And so as the conversation goes on, each of them, her because she understands what's happening, and him even though he doesn't, start to avoid the topics and the tones that cause the glass to make their conversation more difficult. Their connection, despite this, little by little, is getting stronger. Now, let's step out of the story for a second. At this point, we have two people who are living by the rules the glass has implicitly set up for them. She's doing it intentionally, setting aside things she'd normally talk about to try to build trust with a stranger in this context, stories she'd normally tell, questions she'd normally ask. She's trying to make conversation easier. He's doing it unintentionally, assuming that some things are just easier to talk about with this woman he's met, and doing the best to follow the directions he was given to create a trusting relationship with her. And so at this point, we're already forced to ask a question. Can these two people trust each other in that context? Can she feel honest about the person she's presenting to this stranger, knowing that she's changing herself to fit the context of the conversation? Can he feel good about this new relationship, knowing that some things he'd like to talk about have just been set aside, but not quite knowing why? This metaphor, of course, is about as subtle as a sledgehammer. I'm sure you can already see the ways this little parable sets up a conversation about how we communicate with technology that very intentionally constrains and intensifies our social behavior. How it reframes what we mean when we talk about media being optimized for or native to a particular platform or medium. And let's be clear, the technology platforms we use are dissimilar from the glass scenario only in scale and sophistication. Instead of just two people, you have millions, billions of people interacting in these contexts. And instead of just two variables of thickness and transparency to change, you have thousands. But I've tried to demonstrate so far is not just that those rules and effects exist, but whether we understand them or not, that they leave us ill at ease. And in that scenario in which we either knowingly accept that manipulation as the woman has, or mistake it for faults in ourselves or others, as the man has, trust can be hard to come by. And what makes this challenge even more complex is that refusal is no solution. The woman in our glass scenario, understanding what's happening, could certainly simply refuse to speak. She would, in doing that, free herself from the manipulation and the unease that comes with it, but she'd also be quite simply giving up. She could also refuse to change. Instead of changing the subject each time as the glass gets thicker or dark, she could simply carry on with her point as she would have before and ignore the impact the glass is having on her partner's ability to understand her. Again, this would free her from the manipulation and the unease that comes with it, but it would also probably make the conversation quite frustrating and confusing to him. A trusting relationship would remain challenging to come by. And so she can't accept the manipulations being imposed on her, and she can't simply ignore them or refuse to participate if she wants to build a connection with this stranger. I think she needs to do three things. First, she needs to tell him about the glass. If we have any chance of building trust in this new digital world, we have to understand it. We need a common understanding of what its creators are trying to get us to do. We have to identify what kinds of conversations and therefore communities and therefore institutions they've made radically easier to build. And we have to identify what kinds of conversations and therefore communities and therefore institutions they've intentionally or unintentionally excluded. We can't trust each other until we understand the context of the conversations that we're having. Second, she needs to pick up a few vital things that are she needs to pick a few vital things that are being excluded from the conversation that she thinks will be vital to building trust. Our efforts are all limited. We can't replicate everything good we had before in this new digital world. And much of what we had before wasn't good. But before we can build relationships and communities and institutions that matter in this new world, we have to identify what matters and why. And third, she has to work twice as hard to communicate those things that really matter. She has to communicate effectively despite the thicker, darker glass. Too often we can mistake what's easy for what's possible in the kind of world of communications and technology. The technology we live with now has extraordinary capabilities, and yes, often the easiest thing to do with those capabilities is frivolous or distracting or just fine. But what I've seen time and again is that with focus and effort, we can do a lot more than we think we might be able to. At Vox, we've been able to take the tools that were built essentially to help millions of people watch videos of their friends' pets and use them to get millions of people to watch videos about the details and the life and death consequences of a CBO report. But that work is only possible, and we're only trustworthy to the extent that we acknowledge and educate our audience about the context, are deliberate about picking out the things that matter, and are able to pour intelligence and energy and resources into communicating those things despite the changing glass. Finally, a quick word about some of the work that you all do, and a little bit about in the context of the work that I tried to do with this. A few years ago, because I was frustrated with the kind of world that was being created in the context and the incentives that were being built for media and for our attention, I tried to build this social media platform, Tens of thousands of people joined, the Times wrote its breathless story, and we had our moment. But what I quickly saw was that getting people to step away from Facebook, from Twitter, from Snapchat, it's a huge lift. We may only be a decade into the social media era, but habits are very hard to break. And they're especially hard to break on a short timetable of a very baby startup with investors and people to pay and the challenges of, you have 2 years to try and get something that people will keep giving money to. The competition is too rich, too powerful, and the habits are too entrenched. But alternatives from communities like this could actually succeed where I couldn't. With resources, patience, and smarts, you could actually build new ways of creating community and trust with a set of rules closer to the values that we all share. You could be building these kinds of platforms outside of the economic structures that have made them what they are. In short, you could build us all a better glass. And with that, I'd love to take your questions.
So what we'll do is, I'll start a brief conversation over here, and then I'd love to open it up. But the first thing, Andrew, I really want to talk about is that there seems to be this dichotomy where the pressures of the algorithm, the pressures of the social media, and what is best practice to get things out on channels is the visual, the short, the punchy, and yet you and your history of what you've done is you've been an expert in kind of this long form with the work that you did frontline and this, and almost the idea of a slow news movement. So here at Yale, we do a lot of wonderful research, and academics and our labs and our institutes are creating stuff in long form. So how do we square that circle in taking our research and making it and making it part of the conversation and not just stuck there?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the first things I would say is long form can do exceptionally well on a Facebook or a Twitter or a lot of the platforms that right now, most of what they do is certainly to incentivize a lot of short form and ephemeral content. But if you can produce something that is good enough to basically outcompete everything else and becomes the prestige thing to read, so at a place like The Atlantic, we certainly could get millions and millions and millions of views on 20,000 words on the case for reparations. But you really have to basically be able to outcompete everything else in the world at that moment, which is an incredibly high bar in order to kind of break into that space. And so I think if you're trying to reach more niche audiences and not the kind of national or international prestige audiences, you have to think about distribution outside of those platforms. And so I think obviously what I was trying to do with this is important. I think email newsletters are a really powerful way right now that people are kind of moving outside of the kind of constant check-in mentality to find things that are more finishable, that feel like they're coming to them at a time in which they want them, that are pushed to them. So one of the things that's really important to think about in terms of where the internet is taking us is a newspaper or a magazine was a product that was pushed to you. You had to make a decision once to subscribe, right? And usually that was a kind of purchase in which you were saying like, the kind of person I would like to be is the kind of person that reads the New York Times every day. And so here's my, whatever the sub number is, my $20 a month to have it sent to me. And then you weren't picking up a thing and having the Times compete with sexy headlines to try and get your attention. It was just arriving. And so the Times could kind of count on the built-in audience that their credibility and the attention that they'd given you came with that kind of distribution. Newsletters are similar, which is you've connected to someone and gotten them to say, just send this to me. I'm not going to force you to compete in this noisy marketplace of headlines on these different feeds. Push it in my direction because I trust your brand or I want that thing, even if it isn't as sexily packaged. So that's a kind of powerful starting point.
So, can you walk us a little bit specifically? Well, let me ask you something about Vox, because Vox is doing this very well. Vox is taking these things that are incredibly complex and turning it into a compelling manner. So what does that factory look like? What is when you log into Slack and you're in that newsroom, that virtual newsroom, like can you tell us a little bit about that process?
Yeah, God, where to start? So first of all, one thing that I think is important for me to say about Vox is I've been there for 6 months. Another 6 months, I'll start taking credit for things that are done there. In the meantime, I'm just happy to speak on their behalf and celebrate the work they're doing. So a couple of things. One, Vox has the benefit of being a part of this bigger media company, right? So Vox Media is, as Franz said in the introduction, I think probably one of the, along with maybe BuzzFeed and Vice, most successful digital media companies in the world, $1 billion valuation, 800 employees.
It's a unicorn.
Yes, that's a blessing and a curse. But we have a kind of huge operation of people supporting each of these editorial brands, right? So the company's about 800 people, and about 400 of them are non-editorial, doing sales, product, marketing, and basically building a platform, whether it's the growth and analytics team building a kind of data set that's constantly being pushed back into the newsroom so that with analysis about what's working and what's not working, or the platforms team that is working closely with a company like Snapchat or with YouTube to kind of get on the next page with whatever they're going to build next. We benefit hugely from the kind of all of the network effects that come with being a part of that multi-brand site. And then I think for Vox, I mean, there's a lot of little like detail things, whether it's the kind of meeting structures or the data feedback, but it's also, I think, the culture of the place is one in which I think Mike had a good slide earlier today about like, you don't want to just publish a book, you want to publish you want a New York Times bestseller. And like, that is the culture of the kind of journalists that come to Vox, is that people are there because they understand that like, it's a noisy world, and if they write something that is righteous and that no one reads, who cares? They want to write something that's righteous that lots of people read. They want to have an impact, and they're driven by that in their bones, and that makes it so that instead of dragging people towards those goals, people are just instinctively built that way.
So you mentioned the platform, and I've known you spoke about Vox as being a product company. So can you speak a little bit more about the importance of the content management system at Vox and the platform and the role that you see the CMS playing?
Yeah, so the CMS at, it's actually funny. We were just talking about the fact that YaleSites is built on a CMS that we had worked together on 10 years ago. In a similar way, the Vox Media CMS is built on another CMS that was a part of this kind of open source grassroots kind of media movement starting 10 years ago. So our CMS is called Chorus. We have a large engineering and design team that works on it on a regular basis. They're constantly taking feedback from journalists about things that they can improve. For the most part, what they're doing right now is making the tools of production as easy to use as possible. So there are kind of two vectors to think about when we think about making media. One of them is how can you close the gap between the creator and publishing and make that process as intuitive as possible so that it is fast, so that the writer feels like they're in total control of what they want to put out into the world, or the writer or video or graphics creator. So that is where most of the emphasis in Vox has been in the last year or two, which is taking this huge CMS that now all the 8 brands are on one big instance of it, and building, kind of streamlining the production process to make writing easier and faster, whether it's UI work, whether it's actually building new databases to allow people to pull things into their content really easily, new embedding tools. That's kind of category one. And then we have a storytelling team that is like a 10-person design development SWAT team, and that on big feature projects will kind of swoop in to do something more bespoke and intricate, and then the learnings from them will go back into that core team. So basically, they'll go out and, you know, Ezra interviewed Hillary Clinton last summer, did like a big 10,000 word feature about Hillary Clinton's leadership style and the kind of gendered politics of it. That was published in a way that was a big, beautiful, kind of multi-part interactive. And then it was mass distributed all across different platforms as a 10-minute YouTube video, as a podcast, an interview. It kind of exploded.
So when we deal with faculty, and so faculty are kind of the faculty have been raised in this kind of academic publication, you know, with kind of a fear of being a public intellectual, or sometimes too much mass media exposure will kind of impact their reputation. It's worse than hipsterdom. They really want to be underground, right? And it's a fundamental, and for a lot of the people in the room here, there's a fundamental tension here, because our job is to kind of get out the research kind of publication and bring Yale out to the world. So what's your advice for, you know, the people in the audience who are, you know, dealing with the faculty members? What should they be saying to the faculty members to kind of to inspire them to say, you know what, you need to think about how information is going to be presented on our platform. You need to think about, you know, the storyboarding and how you're telling the tale and the narrative.
So in this case, is the stuff already being published and they just don't care about how it's being published, or is it? Yeah,
I mean, they don't. It's fine. Let's just have it in the PDF and let's write it. And the title needs to remain this academic title, because, of course, everybody will know what it means. I mean, I had a conversation earlier about that. Like, they don't want to. The language needs to be precise, and right. And for us, we're like, listen, no one's going to read this. Yeah. So. How do we solve that problem?
Ooh. Yeah, I don't know if you do. I mean, I hate to say it.
That's all, folks.
No, sorry. Yeah, I just think like at some level, their bosses need to tell them that that's something that they care about. I mean, I don't know that. I mean, what I said about the Vox journalist is true, which is that it is something. I mean, it is very reminiscent to me of conversations that people used to have about newspaper journalists, right? Which is a certain sense. And even when I was at Frontline and was brought in to help kind of make the TV show a more digital and kind of modern organization, there were still a lot of people who basically believed, like, no, the reason that we are at Frontline is that we left commercial television, we're working for PBS, we want to do the most righteous possible thing, and then like let someone else worry about how it lives out in the world. And I just think that that's like, the only argument I have for that is just like, that's useless. Like we've moved from a world of information scarcity into a world of information abundance. Like, we have never had the kind of the steepness of the curve up in terms of the volume of things competing for our attention now has gone up so exponentially quickly that there's no such thing as guaranteed distribution or attention. And if that's the business you're in, you have to understand it. Otherwise, you just might as well give up.
Yeah, there's a I don't know if the audience knows, there's a crazy stat out there that every 18 months, you know, we have the Moore's Law right every 18 months that the processing power doubles, but there's a corollary to it that every 18 months, the entire amount of information in the world is doubling. So, I mean, we have this really big kind of signal to noise ratio. So, let's say we manage to kind of convince our faculty members that, you know, they need to think about distribution, they need to think about getting their ideas out there. It's not enough to just write it and have it in the ivory tower, because people are coming now and we have to think about pushing, as you said earlier. So if we wanted to get to a platform like Vox or make our research there, what should we be thinking about, and what should we be telling our peer institutions of how we should be formatting stuff to give you guys the information and the tools to be a primary resource? Because I mean, Vox is suffering from you're telling the narrative, you're not doing as much, you know, reporting. So as an institution here that's, you know, doing the research, how can we get you to make cool videos for us?
I mean, one is just pitch us. I mean, I think so our reporters and writers and video creators are first and foremost explainers and popularizers of complex ideas, right?
Teachers.
Like, sure. No, I mean that's fair. And so they are always on the lookout for new studies, new research, new things to understand that will allow them to kind of go out and get millions of people to see that thing and idea. So to some extent, it's just a question of like, pitch the writers, develop relationships with the writers on those beats. You know, I doubt there's a kind of science writer or a politics writer who's not going to want to hear from a political science professor or a biology professor at Yale. I'm sure they'd be happy to have that conversation. But having that relationship is certainly useful. In terms of the content and production, I mean, like you said, like a PDF is just not going to, that's table stakes, right? Like that's like, okay, this is in an old world format, like that's not useful. But certainly like data viz is useful for anything that's complex and research based to allow that kind of us to tell that story more simply. That will always be a tool that we will happily grab a graph that is really great from some research report and with permission kind of republish it because it can demonstrate complex ideas in a really important way. Yeah, I'm not sure beyond that.
Well, let's open it up to questions. I'll bring you over here. I'm going to do my Phil Donahue right now.
All right.
I'm dating myself now.
Hello.
Hi.
I would like to hear a little bit more about the transparent glass.
Yeah.
And I mean, I would like to hear you talk a little bit more about how do you educate the community who reads how do you help people become discerning consumers of information? Because I think that is a huge problem. I mean, there's a recent American Library Association put out some nice guidelines, which is helpful for the libraries to be helping us with this kind of thing. But like as a mass kind of communication vehicle, what are you doing to ensure that you are putting forth viable, intelligent, smart, verifiable information? And how do you share that information with the people who consume it?
Yeah, so, well, one, I mean, on the question of just like how do we make sure that it's verifiable, you know, I mean, just a traditional editorial process of reporting and editing. I don't think there's anything, there's lots of new tools for a lot of that stuff, which is to say that there's lots of new ways to, you know, gather data and verify things, and research has never been easier in the era of Google. But basically, it's the same process it's always been of fact-checking and reporting and editing. On the question of distribution and education, so I don't know. I think that actually, like, Vox had a little bit of a trick for how it basically established itself as kind of in opposition to the modern day distribution and publishing tools when it launched, but has since basically completely taken advantage of them, which is to say, when Vox launched, Ezra and Melissa and Matt talked a lot about the problem of the way in which news organizations are built to kind of chase the now. And this is not a Twitter problem, this is a newspaper problem, right? This is like, everyone's built to say, like, what's the next thing that happened on my beat? As opposed, and that's only accelerated by virtue of kind of social platforms and modern distribution. Whereas what is actually useful to most audiences is actually a lot of the context for why that new piece of information is interesting or important, right? There's an assumption that comes out of traditional journalism mentalities that there are basically two different kinds of audiences. There are either highly, highly informed, curious audiences or highly uninformed, uncurious audiences. When in fact, the vast majority of people are curious and not as informed as they'd like to be. Because we're all fucking busy. Like, we just have lives, and like a lot of stuff happens in the world, and it's hard to keep up with it all, right? And so that kind of, when Vox launched, they launched with a kind of product and a mentality that we were going to do the kind of deep explainers. We were going to, and they had a kind of the Card Stacks product that was a kind of permanent record of an issue that was going to be constantly updated, but function as the kind of core offering that was in defiance of the kind of great technology companies that were ruining our attention and having us overly focused on the new. In the end, frankly, like, that didn't work as well as we had hoped, partially just because it's true, like Facebook and Google and Twitter and all these other companies own consumer attention. But I think it helped to establish, especially with an early audience, a sense that Vox cared about something other than whatever the Facebook algorithm was going to tell them to care about. I think a lot of media companies we've seen in the last couple of years have done this and then this, because basically they over-optimize for whatever the kind of trendy new way of publishing is. They piss off their audiences because their audiences are like, oh my God, this is so cynical, I can't take it. And they burn their kind of brand to the ground because it's not clear they stand for anything other than virality and growth and whatever that garbage is. And so, like, when Vox stands up and says, actually, like, we're going to be the nerds that like try to get everyone to like eat their policy spinach, like that helps to differentiate us from kind of other people and shows that we care about things other than just kind of growth for growth's sake. I don't know if I answered your question, but
it's a hard question.
I really think I could have been like a talk show host in another life. I'm taking way too much joy out of this.
You want to? Sure. My name is Michael Paris. I'm over at ITS. One question I had sort of about your sort of glass metaphor was one of the limitations I saw is that even if the glass wasn't there, there are still sort of human barriers to building trusting relationships.
Totally.
And I'm wondering if instead of, or in addition to viewing the glass as sort of this additional difficulty that you stack on top of these human limitations, if you can use technology to sort of get around some of those human limitations, and sort of what your thoughts are about technology as a way to just sort of, and you know, distribution, whatever, as a way to bridge those just sort of wetware constraints instead of as an additional set of constraints.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and I like that thought a lot. And I can think of a couple of ways in which it's very true. I mean, obviously, for one thing, one of the powerful things that the glass, being computers and digital technology, have done is those two people can be anywhere in the world, and that's obviously like the number one piece of this whole communications revolution is the kind of the end of geography as the kind of means for needing to be in the same space or whatever. Similarly, like translation technology, I think is powerful. And I do think that like even in the way in which I framed this, the focusing, the way in which like, you know, I ran a social media site that said you can only share one thing a day. Like that was very intentional, like, hey, we are constraining you Twitter says 140 characters. Those constraints can be, to your point, that focus can be empowering in really powerful ways, right? Like without Twitter, it's hard to imagine some of the kind of social upheaval, for better and worse, that we've seen in a lot of other countries. I think, everyone's funnier when they have to edit. So that is good, right? I think that's, I don't mean the metaphor to necessarily to be inherently negative, but I think it's useful for us to be self-aware about both the positives and the negatives.
So I'm going to just say the phrase fake news. Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, so to me, fake news is or at least, hoaxes, propaganda. I mean, so I think basically those are extensions of a bigger social problem of kind of tribalism, which is to say that like those things wouldn't exist if people didn't want them to exist, right? So what is happening is that people's desire to have their tribal identities validated is overwhelming their desire to know things that are true. And so it's just feeding the same frenzy that also has polarized the country in lots of other ways. And so to me, it's just an extension of that. I do think that social platforms and Google too, it's not just social platforms, do have to do a better job of policing what is there and what is not there. It's a huge challenge, but they could do a lot better. Oftentimes in these types of markets, it's like with email spam, there's a lot of patterns. You can identify some of the worst behavior. You can kind of start to knock back the trend overall simply by kind of attacking some of the big players in the space. But to me, it's actually it's a symptom of a deeper disease that has been caused by the way in which we are now all associated in these networks, and not just in virtual networks, right? There's a great book by Bill Bishop from 10 years ago about the Big Sort, right? If we think that the country is tribal and a little scary now, imagine what it's going to be like in 20 years when most of the voting population has basically never met someone who votes differently than they have, because we are now so sorted by neighborhood and city according to kind of partisan and cultural identity. That's what scares me about it.
Can you talk a little bit about how people curate what they read? So, mixing it up a little bit, making sure that you have conversations with other people who have other points of view instead of just your point of view. And how do we make sure that happens more often?
Oh, I wish I knew. Yeah, I mean, I think we all know that we have to. It's just harder and harder to do. There are various experiments. I know, for example, that Facebook ran an experiment in which they tried to surface, below an article, they would try to surface alternative points of view. So it'd be if you saw some liberal article, then it'd be and so on, the other people say. And basically no one clicked on them. And so to some extent, I think we just all have to individually will ourselves into doing this thing that is not as easy to do. I'm not sure I have a kind of collective solution for us other than that. I think that in addition to the kind of challenge of the filter bubble, and I think there's also just a question of how we kind of put ourselves back in the driver's seat when we have these distraction devices in our pockets all day long. Obviously they're insanely powerful and amazing, and I couldn't live without one. But I've started to I delete the kind of various social apps off of my phone most of the time, unless I'm oh, there's a big breaking news story, I need to have Twitter on my phone. And therefore it just takes me a few more seconds to kind of download it, and it becomes default off, so that in those blank moments in which I'm kind of looking up at the sky, I'm not oh my God, what's going on Twitter, which ends up being a waste of time. I actually get crazy about this. I've used the parental controls in my iPhone to then go and ban Twitter and Facebook from my browser as if it's pornography. Because I can be so crazy about oh my God, I turned off the app, but I still want to see. And again, none of this actually prevents me from doing it. If I want to do it, I can turn it off. I know the code. But at least it forces me to be intentional about going and using those tools instead of allowing them to dictate to me kind of when and how I should go and check on them.
I've seen you post on Facebook, oh, I've lost my phone, I don't think I'm going to buy a new one this weekend.
I spent the entire month of August last year without a phone.
It's great.
Hi, Dan, I'm Christian. I work in the FA's dean's office. I don't know if you know what that is.
Sounds
but
great.
anyway, yeah, it's great. Dan kind of pilfered my question a little bit, but this is more of an extension, I guess, of this kind of notion of confirmation biases in audiences that almost lead to like a polarization, like rather than having even one glass, it's like two completely separate sets of glass at times. And so, like, what is Vox doing, I guess, to fight the tendency of audiences to really establish allegiances for different media outlets? I mean, how do you fight off the moniker of, like, liberal trash or whatever for the right wing, or if you are more of a right wing leaning or conservative, like, publication, the notion that you're, like, bigoted or conservative or something like that? Because it seems like the era in which you have kind of unbiased news broadcasting has kind of come to an end. Or if it hasn't come to an end, at least audiences believe that everybody is on some sort of side.
Yeah, so this is a hard one. So it's just, so a couple things. One, I would argue that there was never a thing called unbiased news broadcasting of any kind. It just happened to be rich white guys in cities, and so they got to pretend that their views of what was important and what wasn't a bias. I'm sure there are lots of people who suffered in lots of ways in this country for a long time before Walter Cronkite cared about the Vietnam War, who don't see Walter Cronkite as being unbiased because it took him 5 years to care about, even though we celebrate the fact that he finally did. So that's like number one. Like, I reject the idea of objectivity, and this is me personally. I think Ezra and the editorial team would have their own complex feelings that would be similar to mine, but I don't want to necessarily speak for them. I just think that that's a false idea. The binary between objectivity and subjectivity, as if some person can suddenly remove themselves from their body and exist on some other plane in which they don't have identity and belief and values, doesn't work for me. What there is there's fair process. There's an attempt to try to apply the same rigor to analyzing the things that you would like to believe as you do to the things that you might not like to believe, so that you're not allowing yourself to get stuck in a kind of ideological trap. And we push people really hard on this, and basically say, listen, it is your job not to pretend that you don't know things or don't feel things or don't have an identity or don't have values, but to be humble about what you do and don't know, because you're just like a little person in this speck of big complex world. And to show your work so that someone who doesn't agree with you about where you're coming from can still value the thing that you're doing, because you're demonstrating the insights that you've gathered and how you've gathered them in a way that is useful beyond the group of people who might agree with you at the beginning. I'd say one other thing about this, which is this is incredibly difficult, because what I just articulated is like this like abstract philosophical blah 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 blah, and like this is a tool that is being weaponized right now by the White House and by professional propagandists, especially on the right. There are plenty of them on the left, but I don't think we are in a equal sides do equal things moment right now. And so it's really hard to make this very nuanced, complex argument about being fair and about being honest about where you're coming from when you're being attacked with a kind of blunt object from the places that you're being attacked. And so I just think it's a really big struggle, because even if you're doing that being as fair as you can, like if one side basically says the sky is red, like you end up in a kind of lose-lose situation. I'm such a bummer today. I'm just like...
My name's Tracy. I work in the student wellness office, and so one of my goals is to get resources out to students about stress management and sleep and all the things that...
Can you come help our newsroom?
Yes, absolutely. And so I do this mostly through mindfulness training, meditation, and I noticed you said, pausing up and looking up at the sky or having a month without your phone, and so I'm wondering, in your own exploration of all this input and this data that comes to you, how you take that pause to notice what is might maybe noticing your own biases in that moment, or how you do that with the people that you work with, and then how we might scale that up to others.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that we're thinking a lot about right now, a couple of different ways. Well, I mean, obviously there's the editorial question of just like how do you check yourself and how do you make sure that you're not falling into some of these traps and being self-aware. That's something that I think in our case comes from the top down, right? So Ezra, our editor-in-chief, Lauren Williams, our executive editor, they are constantly saying to people like, you have to be fair, you have to be fair. Ezra wrote a long memo to the staff internally just after the election, basically saying like, I don't care what else we do next year, but like I want this newsroom to be known as being decent. Like it is going to be really fucking hard to be decent on the internet in 2017, and that is like goal number one. And so that's something that I think from the top in our newsroom is being modeled. No one's perfect. We make mistakes on that all the time, from the top all the way down to the bottom, but we're trying really hard on that. The self-care part of it is a huge challenge for us right now, right? Like everyone in our newsroom was working, 18 hours a day throughout the election, and then election day came, and it was like, how about 20 hours a day? There was no break, right? It just went straight through into this kind of new sprint of this new kind of surprising, crazy world. And so we're actually in the process of, like, you mentioned Slack earlier. For anyone who doesn't know, Slack is a kind of team chat platform in which people are in different group rooms and everyone has it on their phone, and basically at any time of day I can pick up my phone and message all 800 people in the company on this kind of group chat. And we've just rolled out a series of kind of norms and regulations inside the company about like, do not direct message someone after these hours unless it's an like we kind of are trying to create some norms so that people can feel like they don't need to be attached to their phone all the time and can like relax a little bit and recharge. But I don't think we've figured it all out. I think it's just something we are thinking a lot about it all the time.
So it seems like there's a political strategy right now. If in football terms, people would say, the modern football offense plays with tempo, right? So it's a hurry up offense to keep the defense on the thing. And it seems like there's a politics of a hurry up offense, right? Where we're going to do some things so quickly that you're not going to be able to defend and you're not going to know which way to hit there. Now, not to bring up an old wound, but you had this slow news movement with this, and you really kind of did the opposite. So if you had like that entrepreneur bad dream, if you could relive your mistake, relive your experiment with this.
Mistakes? You say mistakes?
No, I didn't say mistakes. If you could do it again, knowing now what you know, what would you do differently with this? And just so you know that this, it was a social network where you were only allowed to share one link per day. And when you had that, there was this incredible amount of quality in there because you didn't want to waste that one link. So how would you do it differently? How would you slow things down?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that there are a couple different things here. One of them is even if this were the biggest platform in the world, it wouldn't stop the Trump administration from doing 14 things a day. And I think it probably would be a poor platform for keeping up with the news of everything that's happening. And there is actually just a volume of important news coming beyond the one thing a day, in general. It doesn't mean that couldn't still be a good product for you to have context and have a kind of magazine-like experience in which, yes, you want to know like that there's a new executive order, but you also occasionally want to like step back and get someone to share something that is more contextual and wide view in nature. But at some point, like the news is just actually importantly happening that fast, not fake happening that fast, right? The old problem was like, oh God, Politico is so annoying. They're constantly coming up with little micro scoop bullshitty things that aren't real news, but they can put a screaming headline on it and tweet it out, and that feeds the beast of the social media churn, but is not real in its news value. We do not have a volume news value problem right now. There is way too much that is actually important to cover in a day. I think Vox actually is pretty well set up for it. So because of the fact that our reporters are meant to be like policy experts, they're oriented towards the context. And what we try to do is have them hit the kind of like this thing that you've seen in the news explained about like anywhere from 1 to 24 hours after it actually is kind of being chattered about. And so as a publisher, I feel really good about kind of how we fit into that ecosystem. I don't know if I have like a platform solution for that. I mean, I think like this was never meant to be like a pure alternative to Twitter. Twitter's great for breaking news. It was meant to be, I mean, it wasn't meant to be a replacement. It was meant to be an addition. It was meant to be like, actually, we need one thing for one thing, and we need a different thing for certain modes and contexts.
You have the honor of getting the last question, so no pressure here. Don't ruin it.
All right, here goes. My name is Lauren. I work in the Office of Development, which is the fundraising office here at Yale. If we could change gears for a little bit, I wanted to go back to your discussion of really like long-form journalism and long-form pieces in, an age of Twitter of 140 characters where, as you pointed out, everything is so ephemeral, but it also makes it easy to consume, so much of it at one time. When looking at a long-form piece that is really successful and is better than anything else, and that's how it breaks out of all that noise. If you could talk about what makes, something for 20,000 words, worth the half hour it takes to read it.
What makes that worth that from a publisher's, like how can you reverse engineer that if you're trying to publish that kind of work?
Yeah, how do you know in advance it's going to be worth your while to get it out there?
Yeah, well, I mean, so the funny thing, I was at the Atlantic when we published The Case for Reparations, and I had gone down to DC that day, and we had put, I've known Ta-Nehisi for a long time, and he's this amazing writer, and he had written this kind of opus, and everyone was really proud of it, and proud that we put this thing on the cover of the magazine. And I remember talking to the PR people, and they were like, yeah, like, we've put like copies of it out into the world, and like no one wants to like, this was pre-publication, it was like, Fresh Air doesn't really want to book him, like the Daily Show doesn't want it, no one's really interested. And then I was in DC the day it published, in a meeting with some of the other executives, and everyone was kind of like feeling sad, but like feeling proud. Like I was like, well, we did the right thing, this is like important journalism. But the night before, when it had hit publish, because of, I think really because the appetite for that idea was kind of I mean, this is just like a hard thing to replicate. It's like people were ready, like there's a radicalism that people are feeling in general, that they're willing to attach themselves to something that used to feel like an old left idea. I think Ta-Nehisi, by virtue of the credibility he's earned as a writer, because you just know it's going to be a gorgeously written thing and morally kind of reasoned in an interesting way. It had landed, and like Twitter like melted down in the kind of media space. It was like people tweeting like, this is so good, and you're like, well, it published 3 minutes ago, so you definitely didn't read it. But there was just a sense of like excitement about it, and suddenly like I was in this meeting and the PR person came in and was like, everyone wants to talk to him. Like, it was like that's really hard to do, right? So I think in that case you have writer. I think the Atlantic has something that I'm jealous of, which is they do have those 10 covers a year, which is a really special way for them to be able to signal. In the same way that this was about like creating limitations in order to signal this is something that is special. By only having 10 covers, even though like the print product is read by like no people, I mean 500,000 people, but like nothing compared to the website, which is huge. They're able to signal out to the world, this is one of the 10 things we think is really valuable to you this year. And we think a lot about like how do we replicate some of those dynamics at Vox as we expand that kind of work. So yeah, you have writer, you have scarcity, you have brand, and it's really important. Like, it took a long time. I mean, Ta-Nehisi's been working at building that rep for a long time, so that when he publishes something like that, people are excited to read it. And so it's hard not to value also just the individual writer and the credibility that they can earn over time.
And I think that speaks to one of the themes you talk about, the importance of building trust and that role that has in facilitating communications. Thank you, Andrew, for joining us.